Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. When we mess things up, is there any hope that God can bring good out of our situation? Well, today in our study of Joshua chapter 2, we'll see that indeed the Lord will graciously embrace a person and even redeem their life when they come to Him in faith. And so, welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast, where we're going through the key chapters of God's Word, one chapter per day. Today we are turning to Joshua chapter 2, and we're going to see how God will embrace sinful people and even redeem their lives when they come to Him in faith. Now, yesterday we began our study in the book of Joshua in Joshua chapter 1. And in that chapter, the Lord called Joshua to be strong and very courageous, to step on up and lead the people. The people supported him and committed to joining him in the work that God had called him to do. Well, now today we're in Joshua chapter 2. It's still pretty much the same period of time. The year is 1405 BC. Joshua and the people are on the Plains of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan River. On the western side is the Promised Land, the land that they've been waiting to enter ever since God delivered them from Egypt 40 years earlier. Now, you'll remember that God had promised this land to Abraham back in Genesis 12, although more specifically in Genesis 15 when the Lord gave Abraham the actual boundaries for this Promised Land. But God had promised to Abraham and his descendants that this would be their land. All they would have to do now is to go into it and possess it. And so they kind of did that 40 years earlier, but you'll remember the people mutinied against the Lord. And so in Numbers 13 and 14, the Lord steps in and he tells everyone that only Joshua and Caleb and the kids of the next generation would enter this promised land. And so now that former generation has all died off, including Moses, and now it's time for Joshua and Caleb to lead this next generation now to enter into God's promises, and things get rolling in verse 1. Verse 1 says, "Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, 'Go, view the land, especially Jericho.' And so they went and came into the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and lodged there." And so Joshua is sending a couple spies into this land here. And this is kind of what happened 40 years earlier, only less spies and less surveying. And that's probably because Joshua was on the first reconnaissance journey 40 years earlier. He probably still remembers the basic lay of the land. He just wants these spies to go in, check things out, and focus on Jericho. Now, Jericho was an important walled city in the Jordan Valley. In fact, it's considered the oldest city in the world. It was and is surrounded by numerous natural springs. It was the gateway to the central regions of what would become northern Israel. And so Jericho will be the first stop of the Israelites in their conquest of this land. And so going back to verse 1 here, a lot's going on here in this verse here. And so in verse 1, Joshua sends 2 spies to go into the land, and he does it secretly. Now, that word secretly likely points to the manner that Joshua is sending these spies, in the sense that he is sending them in a way that the rest of the people, the rest of the children of Israel, don't even know these guys are going in. They're just going on in. And so these spies go into Jericho, and they lodge at the house of a prostitute named Rahab. Now, this might send our minds thinking about all the things that this visit might entail, but we don't have to worry about that. For one thing, the Hebrew wording here indicates that this stop is truly just for lodging. It specifically lacks the kind of vocabulary that would indicate something else was going on. Not only that, but the Lord took purity very seriously. We'll see this in Joshua 7 when he has Achan destroyed for violating his law. He also calls the people to consecrate themselves in Joshua 3, and nothing of this kind of morality is mentioned there. In fact, the innocent presentation of this matter probably means that Rahab's place was more like an inn or a tavern or something like that. Back then, it was common for these kinds of places to offer various services, including simply just being a place to sleep. And that seems to be the case here. Now, that still begs the question, though, why were these spies even here? Why not just stroll around the city and act like they own the place? Well, we got to remember that these guys didn't know yet that the Lord was going to knock down Jericho's walls in chapter 6. They didn't know that the entire city was terrified of them. Their orders were to be secretive, and so it probably just seemed logical to go to a place where 2 out-of-towners wouldn't be noticed, and so they go to an inn on the edge of the city. But their secrecy only lasts until verse 2, and their gig is up, and the people tell the king of Jericho that these 2 spies are in their city. And so in verse 3, he sends word to Rahab basically saying, "Cough them up." She then lies in verses 4 and 5 and says, they're not here, they were, but they've gone. They went that way. Of course, we know from verse 6 that she's really hidden them on the roof under some flax. And for what it's worth, flax is a kind of plant that can be made into yarn. It looks kind of like prairie grass. It could be 3 or 4 feet long, and it was probably on Rahab's roof drying in the heat of the sun for her to make into yarn later on. Anyway, these spies here, they're hidden on the roof under the flax, and the Jerichoans, or whatever you want to call the people who live in Jericho, the Jerichoans go off and look for them. And after they leave, Rahab then goes back up to the spies, and she says to them in verse 9, and listen what she says. She says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And then she says in verse 12, Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you will also deal kindly with my father's household and give me a pledge of truth. You can imagine how wonderful these words would have sounded to these spies. Here, the spies of their parents' generation had gone to this land but came out so afraid. Now they're hearing that it was the Jerichoans who were afraid. Unlike their parents, these Jerichoans have heard what God has done and believed Him. And so again, listen to what she says to them in verse 9. She says, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Now, how could she know this? I mean, this is before the Jews have even crossed the Jordan. And yet Rahab is telling them she knows the Lord has given them the land. The word given there, it's in the perfect tense. It's completed action. It's essentially done. And so in Rahab's mind, this land belongs to the Lord and His people, and she wants in. She wants to be counted among them and not the people of Jericho. And so she goes on again, back to verses 10 and 11, to tell the spies about how the people of Jericho have heard of all of the Lord's work and how He's delivered the Jews out of Egypt and given them victory in their battles. And in all of this, Rahab is just believing God. She's believing God's promises. God has promised to give the Israelites this land. Rahab believes He's going to keep His word. She is not trusting in Jericho's walls. She is not trusting in their army's strength. Therefore, she is willing to turn from her own people to receive God's promises for herself. She is leaning on the Lord and His word, and she is banking her life on it. No wonder the Bible has so many good things to say about Rahab. She is listed, for instance, in Matthew 1:5 as the mother of Boaz, and that means that she was the great-great-grandmother of King David, and that means that she was a direct descendant of our Lord Jesus Christ. Likewise, Rahab's actions are cited in James 2, verses 25 and 26, as an example of true living faith. And finally, she's listed in the hall of faith in Hebrews 11, verse 31. And here's what that verse says. It says, By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And I think that verse there in Hebrews 11:31 helps us understand Rahab's mindset here even better. It says, by faith she did not perish along with those who were disobedient. So think about Rahab's situation here. She's a Canaanite woman who was a prostitute surrounded by the sins of the Canaanite people. Remember that the Canaanites were known for their gross immorality. When we were studying Leviticus 18 a month or so ago, we saw all the kinds of sins that the children of Israel were to not engage in. And it says in Leviticus 18:27 that those particular sins were being practiced by the people who were already living in the land. And so Rahab is a prostitute who is a part of that immoral system. But she wants out. And so she turns from the gods of her people, and she turns from all their sinful, wicked practices, and she surrenders herself to the one true God over all. And listen to how she describes in verse 11. She says, the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And she just gives this incredible, wonderful statement of faith here, which we'll be coming back to in our wrap-up comments in a few minutes. In the meantime, things here in this chapter have taken an unexpected turn of events for these spies. These spies came into the land not knowing what to expect. They find out that the people were dreading them, and we can see their own confidence and faith growing in verse 14, and they promise to save her life and to deal kindly and faithfully with her. And then in verse 15, they climb out of her window, which is in the wall of the city, and probably she's an outcast, and the rest of the city is just being patrolled by these guards looking for these spies. And so the spies, they just kind of leave through the wall. They escape to the mountains. The Jerichonians look for them, can't find them. And when the coast is clear, the spies go back to Joshua in verse 23. And unlike the parent spies 40 years earlier, these guys are thrilled with what they have found. And they say to Joshua, "Surely the Lord has given all of the land into our hands. Moreover, all of the inhabitants of the land have melted away before us." They're quoting Rahab. They're sounding a lot like Joshua and Caleb back 40 years earlier. And here you just see this great principle that Joshua and Caleb had this kind of faith 40 years earlier. They stuck with it. They stuck it on out. They kept leading the people. And now that same kind of faith is the faith of these people 40 years later. And so what a difference we're seeing in this next generation that the Lord has raised up. That previous generation was fearful and grumbling. This next generation is ready to trust God and take Him at His word. And over the next couple of days, we're going to be reading about their conquest and really their conquest of faith as they enter into the promised land. So that's Joshua chapter 2. But before we go, I want to make a couple comments about the obvious challenges in this passage. For one thing, Rahab is a prostitute. How come God blesses her? Well, we've already touched upon the answer. Rahab is an example of trusting faith. Her faith is mentioned in Hebrews 11:31, James 2. Her faith trusted in God's power, His promises, His forgiveness. Rahab believed that God was true and just and worthy to follow, and she was willing to forsake this world and her entire life so that she might enter into fellowship with the true God and His people. She's just a great picture of what it looks like to step out in faith and cling to God. Now, someone might wonder, though, well, how could God use such a sinful person? Well, that question assumes that there are any times when we act with total purity and holiness where we deserve God to work in us because we're so good. That's just not the case. If God waited until we acted righteously, He would never work in our lives because we're always acting sinfully one way or another. Isaiah 64:6 says, "All of our righteous deeds are as filthy rags." Therefore, everything we do for the Lord is tainted with some kind of sin, and maybe just pride or doubt or hypocrisy, but many different things we can do to kind of spoil the pot. But we're seeing here that with Rahab, God is gracious and kind to work through sinners, even sinners like you and I. Speaking of sin, another common question about this passage is, was it okay for Rahab to lie? The short answer is no. The Lord blessed Rahab's faith, not her lie. She didn't have to lie to protect these guys. There are plenty of examples in the Bible where the Lord intervenes to protect His people. But, like we've just said, God uses sinners. That's just how it is. It doesn't mean that we can sin all we want or live any way we want with disregard for God. As God's people, we are supposed to be seeking to live our lives according to God's ways and not our own. But we can never strut around thinking that God is working through us because we've been so holy. Rahab sinned in her service to the Lord. We do too. But thank God for His mercy in still working in us and through us. Now that's Joshua chapter 2, and we know how the story unfolds. In Joshua 6, the army of Israel marches around Jericho for 6 days. On the 7th day, they march around 7 times. In the final time, they blow their horns, and the Lord causes the walls of Jericho to fall flat. The Jewish army rushes in, defeats the city, and spares the life of Rahab and her family. And so Rahab believed God's promises. She put her trust in them and banked her life on them, and she received their blessings. And so, like Rahab, no matter what our past is like, God calls us to trust Him and enter into covenant with Him as one of His people, and then to trust Him to redeem our lives and bring good out of the mess we've made. And so as we wrap up our study today in Joshua chapter 2, let's praise God for His grace and mercy that works in the lives of sinners like us. And with that, thanks for listening. I look forward to catching up with you tomorrow when we unpack Joshua chapter 3. And until then, have a great day and God bless.